Hello and welcome. You can see the disappointment on your face.
I was the one that's supposed to get this wrong.
Hello and welcome to episode 8, I think, of Knee Deep in the Pod. I'm Dan.
And I'm Chris. And this podcast is basically a place for us to talk about games and reminisce about the good old days when we actually had time to play them. This week... Wait, that's you, isn't it? Every freaking time.
We should really label these lines.
Why have we not labelled them? I'm labelling them now. I'm labelling them right now.
It is you that says that normally.
Is it?
You introduced the topic.
Okay, good, okay. So it was me screwing it up, as usual then. The thing is, when you screw it up at the beginning, we just do a retake and it feels like nothing happened.
The magic of editing. Speaking of editing, I just want to note here that due to some technical difficulties during the recording, you might hear a little bit of echo in some of the audio, so apologies for that. Okay, take it away.
And this week, we're going to be talking about game soundtracks.
But before we dive into that, Chris, what have you been playing this week? Is what I would normally ask you, but I think we need to revisit this format now because when do we do follow-up?
Ooh. You mean from all of our fan mail? Or just following up from ourselves, our past selves?
Well, I have a couple of things I wanted to follow up on. So, firstly, in the last episode, or possibly the one before that, you did what can only be described as a spectacular Daffy Duck impression. And when I was listening to it back, I didn't react at all. It was just silence. And I thought that was super weird. So I wanted to follow up on that and say, in reality, I'm sure I was laughing my head off, but somehow it didn't make it into the recording. So it's just this bizarre moment where you do this impression and then just nothing and I just move on.
That's my Muttley. Yeah, you know what? I did notice that because all I do when I'm not recording this podcast, mostly I'm listening to this podcast to the detriment of most other things in my life. Yeah, just listen to this mostly.
How's the marriage counselling going?
I could tell you if I ever went. Haven't got time. Too busy listening to this. Well, thank you for retrospectively complimenting me on my Daffy Duck impression.
Thank you for doing such an excellent impression.
You're welcome.
So the second thing I wanted to follow up on is that in episode 5, we talked about big head mode.
Yes. And
we kind of remarked on the fact that, what happened to big head mode? You know, it's not really a thing anymore. And I wanted to say that, boom, the latest patch of Zao is out and it comes with a big head mode.
Love that. So, you heard it here first, everyone. Zao has a big head mode, which was directly inspired by episode 5 of Knee Deep in the Pod. That's why it's there.
I don't know if I was the one who suggested adding a big head mode, but I was certainly kind of there in the discussions. We were talking about what...
When they were talking about the latest episode of Knee Deep in the Pod. They were like, you were talking about big head mode in that episode. What a great idea, Dan.
That's how it went, yeah. So nice. They added it.
Nice.
Yeah.
Man, there is just I feel like there is just a silliness and a not taking yourself too serious element that doesn't make its way into enough games these days. Very specific. I mean, a lot of games have a very playful narrative and, the characters are whimsical, blah, 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 blah. So maybe I'm being unfair, but what I'm the examples that come to mind specifically are the kind of absurd, like big head mode, which, by the way, and I'm going to sound like an idiot to most people that know about this stuff, but it was only, I was only told this the other day, that the reason big head mode, or one of the big reasons big head mode came about and was popular, was because it made headshots really easy.
Really?
I literally, that hadn't even occurred to me. I just thought, that's silly and fun. And I just thought that was it. But supposedly, it's because it helped with headshots in first-person shooter games.
I know that Unreal Tournament had a big head mutator.
Correct.
But the big head modes I remember were from like the likes of Spyro and games which came before that.
Ah, interesting. So they wouldn't have been relevant there. Maybe it's something that came after. Anyway, well, it is at least an element of the big head mode. So for big head mode fans, there you go. But also, like, the other sort of thing that comes to mind is something like Age of Empires 1 and 2 had these cheats where, like, you could just, like, type in a thing and it would spawn, some units you could use for your army. That's a helpful cheat. You can beat the level because you did fine. But they're not just any units. Like, you could... I think you typed in, like, Big Daddy, and you got this, like, sports car, which is completely, like, not in keeping with the game at all. Like, it's a historical strategy game.
Ancient Roman sports car.
So, and then, like, Big Mama, and you get a different sports car. And then there was another one, which got, like, stormtroopers, like Star Wars. Like, Star Wars is in Age of Empires because of some cheat, and you can just, like, spawn a load of stormtroopers, and then, like, it was wacky. And it was cool.
Yeah.
Like, I love that they could do that, and I just I don't think you see that enough.
No, you don't tend to get cheats in the same way anymore. You get cheats which are like, I don't know, maybe commands that the developers used to help test the game.
Yeah.
Like God mode or the basics. But they're not fun anymore.
No. And we've talked about this a little bit before, and I know I talked about, the Doom Eternal's implementation of sort of cheat codes in their own way, which was cool. They were kind of like a collectible / earnable thing that you could then like switch on. So that was a cool thing. But yeah, just like cheat codes that are available from the beginning, as long as you find them, however you find them. But I remember Star Wars: The Phantom Menace.
I remember
Was basic. I mean, certainly when we were kids. I mean, I'd be interested to try it in modern days and see if this is still the same. But back in the day, that was impossible without the cheats. Like, you couldn't beat the game without the cheats. Like, there was a cheat.
It was hard.
It was super hard.
We beat the game several times, I remember.
Did you?
We did, together.
When you said we...
It was a cherished memory.
I have no memory of like beating the game myself, and I have a lot of memory of using the cheat that made the machine gun basically like this powerhouse like explosion rifle thing.
The cheat code was happy, and it turned the machine gun into turned the bullets into rockets. Basically.
Yeah. That was just like a permanent mode for me. That was just like. If ever I forgot, I was like, oh, is this what the machine gun's supposed to be like? It's like pathetic thing. Oh.
I have this very distinct memory of playing that game, and it was the Coruscant level.
Yeah.
Where you play as Captain Panaka.
Oh, yeah.
And at the end of that level, there's a boss, and I was like really struggling. I was on like, 5 health or something.
Yeah.
And, one more hit from this boss and I was a dead man.
Yeah.
But Captain Panaka's like basic blaster had infinite ammo and the bullets bounced.
Oh.
And I managed to get into a situation where I was just perpetually running away from the boss in sort of a circle. He wasn't able to catch up to me, and I was just firing my blaster and hoping that the ricochets would hit him.
Yeah.
And like eventually it worked. I just whittled down his health. That was a hard game. A great game, though.
It was a great game, but now you're saying it, I'm just thinking, like, we had ways to cheese, like, most of the bosses in that game. Like, there was one...
Oh, 100%.
Yeah, there was one where you fight, like, some monster, like, in Jabba's palace or something, and basically the way to beat that, we found out, was attack it as it's crawling out of a hole, where it's not ready to attack you yet, and just, like, slice it up as best you can with a lightsaber before it even gets out. Like as soon as it's out, you're going to die. So just like just beat it before it's even before it's even alive, basically. And there was another one which was like almost similar to what you just said about like the ricochets, but it was like this boss it's already in the room, but before you get into the room, if you kind of know where to shoot, you can just shoot in that direction a lot, and then before it's even like woken up, basically, and you'll just defeat it that way. So you never have to like fight it as a boss. You just shoot a load, it dies, and then you walk into the room and it's like, haha, you did it.
But you had to choose these bosses because if you tried to fight them fairly, they would just destroy
wreck you. Absolutely wreck you.
Yeah.
Like that's why I'd be so interested to revisit the game, because I'm just like, is it actually that hard? Is it like properly completely unbalanced and you just can't beat it, or were we just a bit rubbish?
I think it was just hard.
Yeah, I think it was just hard.
Yeah.
So let me tell you about something I've been playing lately.
Chris, what have you been playing lately?
I'm so glad you asked, Dan. I have played a little bit of a game called Dredge. I know you are aware of it. Yeah.
Yeah, you have.
In fact, I think, Dan, you've completed it, I think. Is that right?
Did I buy it for you?
I think you bought it for me. I remember it was on one of your lists maybe the previous year, and I think you enjoyed it so much that you got it for me.
Yeah, I think so. I had a great time playing Dredge.
Yeah. I was looking... certainly the last couple months, most of my gaming time is like little snippets of 15, 20 minutes of games that are child safe, that my boys can be like, ooh, can I press that button? Like that's how I've been playing. And I'm scrolling through my library being like, what's children safe, but also like accessible for them to like interact and play a little bit somehow. And I thought, let's try this. I think that might be, this game about boats. This will be all right. And yeah, it was like simple enough that my son could like press a few buttons and feel involved, which is cool. But straight away, I was like hooked by the setup of the
Pun
game.
Intended.
Yeah, pun not intended. But yeah, it totally grabbed me straight away. Like the setup is really simple. Like you're this sailor or fisherman, and you crash in the rocks, and your boat's wrecked. But you're by a little town, and they say, "Hey, we noticed you got wrecked yesterday, and we like dragged you ashore, made sure you were safe. Here's a new boat. Like you can pay it off over time. What we'd really like you to do is just catch a load of fish and bring it back here every day to help feed the town, and it will be prosperous and it'll be great." And but very quickly you start to learn, like there are little hints here and there about like the old fisherman. Like someone used to do this before, but he's not here anymore. And they're like, and they kind of drop these little hints here and there, and you can kind of ask, and they're like, he wasn't very professional, and then he went away. And then you kind of, as you play more, you kind of get more and more little hints about, perhaps there are nefarious reasons or dark reasons why he's not here anymore. And you're basically just the new one, the replacement of the guy that's no longer with us.
Some sinister undertones.
You got it, yeah. And yeah, it has this kind of daily cycle. So every day you're going out to catch fish, and it evolves very quickly. You start to like, someone wants you to deliver a package, someone wants you to talk to their brother in the next town over, and whatever. So you're kind of doing these little bits and bobs and collecting stuff, and you're learning more about fishing and upgrading your boat and all this stuff. And time only moves when you are either moving or fishing, which I quite like that mechanic.
Yeah.
And no one ever tells you don't be out when it's dark. Like when you start playing, you just kind of assume like, it's getting dark, I should get back, have a sleep, sell my fish, and then do it all again. But then there'll be one day when you're out fishing and you don't realise the time's ticked by, and then it's like, oh, it's already like 8 o'clock at night, and gosh, it's foggy, and you know what, and you're trying to make your way home, and your visibility becomes really, really poor, and then like you just catch something in the side of your eye, and you're like, what was that? Was that just? Oh, maybe it was a rock, you know, and you keep going, and like the next day, you know, you get maybe the same thing happens, and then you catch another thing catches your eye that you don't quite make out, and you're like, what was that? Anyway, I've now started to realise like you kind of almost have these little hallucinations, and like things start appearing at night time, and there's like nothing stopping you from being out at night time. It just might not be advisable. Anyway, so that's pretty much where I'm at so far, and I'm having just a great time. Really, really enjoying it.
Good.
Yeah, good. I just love like that. It's just really like, I don't know. It's just made a nice little world, and I feel part of it, and I don't know. It's kind of quite. I mean, maybe it becomes quite complex. I don't know, but it's something just quite. It just feels like a simple but really good idea executed well.
I agree. Yeah. Mechanically, it's very simple, but it's got that sort of addictive quality because you're always making progress. You've always got some goal that you're working towards, and they always seem very achievable. And I really like, based on what you're saying with the day-night cycle, there's this really clever risk-reward system where it's like, oh, I'd really like to stay out a bit longer because I've come all this way and I want to catch some more fish.
Yeah.
But it's getting late and I don't want to be caught out in the fog.
Yeah, yeah. So, yeah, it's been really cool. So I've been playing that, and also I have been playing a little bit more of Zao. So for listeners that don't know, Dan was in part of the team that developed Zao, part of Surgent Studios. So just a bit of context there. And yeah, I've been thoroughly enjoying it. And my son, again, he's kind of been able to like press a few buttons and get involved. And he said the words the other day, "Daddy, this is the best game in the world." So he's enjoying it.
Great stuff.
Right, so Dan, what have you been playing lately?
Chris, what haven't I been playing?
Oh.
I've had a bit of time off work in the lead up to Christmas.
Nice.
And I kind of make a point actually of trying to do this every year. December is like my gaming season.
Ooh, lovely.
This is when I just relax, eat food, and play games. And on top of that, I've just got a VR headset because I'm going to be going on to a new job, which is going to be developing VR games. So they sent me a VR headset, so I've been playing around with that.
Very, very cool.
Yeah.
What's been your top game in the VR headset so far, or maybe your kind of favorite? Tell me about the experience.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and like describe some of the games I've been playing, but just stop me when you feel I've rambled on long enough, because I have been playing quite a lot.
Okay.
I haven't had the VR headset very long, but one of the games I was super keen to try was Morrowind in VR, because Morrowind is just one of my favorite games of all time.
Yeah.
And there's a VR port that someone's made, which is incredible. Like, it's so surreal to be walking around, this island, which I'm incredibly familiar with, but to actually feel like you're there, to be walking amongst these giant mushrooms and seeing the familiar faces of the NPCs like up close, it's very surreal.
That's mad. I'm quite interested to give it a go. Maybe that sounds very cool.
I'd love to show you sometime. The only thing is that, as with any VR game, it can be a bit like dizzying or even like motion sickness inducing sometimes.
Yes.
Because your character is moving around the world, but you're obviously standing in one place.
Right.
So
yeah.
My wife was laughing at me the other day because I was walking around Morrowind and I was like moving my arms and legs as if I was walking because that helps to reduce the motion sickness.
Okay. Yeah. Some people don't get it, but yeah, for me, when I've done VR games, the ones I've fared with the best is when like my movement is basically movement happens when I move, rather than being controlled by a controller or something else. Because then it is weird, because it's like you're moving but you're not, and then I think that's when the sickness comes.
Yeah.
So yeah, one of my top VR games has got to be Super Hot VR. It's like it actually came to mind when I was talking about Dredge, because it has that mechanic of time only moves when you move, and it's kind of this action puzzle game, or kind of very, very cool. But anyway, sorry, I didn't mean to rob you.
No, not at all.
Of the mic.
Yeah, I think a big part of VR development is going to be just trying to reduce motion sickness.
Yeah.
I think that's still a big problem for a lot of players. But thankfully, I'm not affected too badly. I just start to feel like a little bit dizzy after a while. And when I take the headset off, I just feel a bit funny.
Yeah. Wicked. I wonder if that's going to be... Because VR headsets, like, one of the limitations has been that graphically they struggle a bit compared to a console or a full-on PC or whatever. There's only so much computing power in that little headset. Now there are ways around that. You can plug it into your computer, whatever. I've never done that so far, but I do just wonder if like there could be quite an opening to this, like to older games being played, ported in that way, because like the graphical demands presumably are, I'm guessing, would be far less than a more modern title. So perhaps that could be quite a cool way of like introducing games and introducing older games back onto current platforms. Like, oh, you can try the VR version of Morrowind, for example. But I'm sure there could be more.
I think a lot of VR games tend to be quite graphically simplistic because they have to run at a very high resolution and a very high refresh rate. So older games would certainly lend themselves well to that. But I think that, like, my perception has always been that the sort of barrier to entry into the VR world for a lot of people is the cost and the space requirement.
Right,
because you need to have a space you can move around in. But what I've realized is like you don't need that much space.
Yeah.
You just need to be able to stand in one place and swing your arms around without hitting anything. And as far as the cost is concerned, you can get a refurbished Quest 3 for, I think it's 350 quid.
Yeah.
Which is a lot of money, but it's not like a staggering amount. It's comparable to a lot of other modern consoles, I think. I don't know what the PlayStation 5 is going for these days, but
more than that, I think. I think probably, I don't know how you feel about this, but to me, I really enjoy my VR headset, but it is like a supplementary item. Like it's an additional kind of, gaming item. It doesn't replace, my console or my PC. So maybe I wonder if that's, maybe if it gets to a point where it's like, oh, you're getting the PlayStation or you're getting the new the new VR headset, then the cost would perhaps be less of an issue. But I think it's, for me at least, it's like it's an additional cost rather than replacing something you might otherwise have bought.
Yeah, it is certainly a supplementary item because a lot of games that I've been playing, at least, like I'm using the AirLink capability. So the games are running on my computer, but they're being streamed to the headset wirelessly, and that actually works really quite well.
Oh, cool.
So you don't need any cables or anything.
Nice. Cool, man. Well, that was a nice little section on VR. I'm excited to hear more when you have more of a chance to get stuck in. But for now, shall we move on to our topic of the day?
Let's do it. I'll tell you about Slime Rancher another time.
I should hope so. You've rambled on long enough.
Yes, quite right.
So,
let's get cracking.
Absolutely. Video game soundtracks. Why have we chosen that as a topic for today?
Well, if you remember, Chris, when we were first entertaining the idea of a podcast, we did a little warm-up I think this was just before we recorded the first episode. We thought, oh, let's do a little warm up. Let's just talk about music for a bit.
Okay.
And we talked for like 45 minutes.
Did we?
on like game soundtracks. and then we were like, wait, this isn't even the topic for today. Like maybe we'll come back to this.
Yeah.
So I always hoped that we would come back to it.
That's a good enough reason, I should say. Core. I imagine there was a lot of gold in there, and we didn't capture it.
Lost to the sands of time. Actually, I might even have it recorded. I don't know. Did we record it?
Well, if we have, we can bin this off. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Good night.
All right.
Roll VT. No, so, yeah, you're absolutely right. We could talk about video game soundtracks at length. And I think, why don't we start with a place that I think we've both become quite comfortable in, and that is, do we listen to video game music outside of video games? Now, for myself, I've found myself doing that more and more. I'll often find myself, doing working or doing something else that doesn't require a great deal of thought, and so and so having music in the background works just perfectly. But perhaps music with sung lyrics and stuff would be too distracting. Soundtracks, perfect in that space. And so I will find myself listening to entire soundtracks of games specifically on the regular, very often. And I gravitate to some specific favourites, but I know you're the same as well. When do you listen to video game soundtracks?
Yeah, exactly the same. It tends to be when I'm working. I'll just stick a game soundtrack on. It's just nice to listen to. It's familiar. But strangely, I don't listen to game soundtracks in other contexts. Like if I'm cooking, I'll put on some regular music.
Yeah.
But it just seems to be when I'm working.
Yeah, I'm the same. So I wonder what some of our first experiences of video game music might have been. I think that might be an interesting place to start.
Do you mean like our first experience of listening to music outside of the game, or just our first experience?
Our first experiences of video game music, full stop.
It's just like asking what's your first experiences of gaming.
Well,
really.
yeah, it is. But I think, with that context, and I mean, ones that come to mind, certainly, this wouldn't necessarily be the first, but for some reason, games on the Game Boy Advance come to mind. I think because it's very bloops and blops. There's not a great deal of fidelity. It's kind of that sort of stuff. And like the hours I must have heard the same tracks in Pokemon, for example. Yeah, like hours and hours of those tracks, and the battle music and the all that stuff.
Da, 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 da.
And maybe we should roll an example here. But yeah, that battle music is so like iconic, and like immediately puts me back in that place. And maybe that's one of those things actually about the music, is it's such a, I was gonna say it's almost tangible. Like it draws you straight back into that kind of feeling, and you picture the game, and like it takes you there so quickly. I think video game music, unlike any other kind of music, but certainly unlike most music, you will listen to it probably more than most other music. Most music, you listen to it once, you hear it again every so often, maybe you stick on your favourite album, every so often throughout the year, whatever. But like video game music, you might be spending 6, 10, 50, 100 hours in a game.
Yeah.
And that music is with you that whole time. That soundtrack is playing that whole time. And particularly older games, probably the soundtrack was quite limited. There was probably not that much. In fact, Mario, for example, is one that I will come back to and listen to, when I'm working. and there's only like 40 minutes of it. Like it's not that long. It's like half an hour, 40 minutes. Which kind of blew my mind, because I was like, the amount of hours I've sunk into that game, I've never noticed just how how short that is.
But then the levels are very short as well. You'll be in a level for maybe 5 minutes tops.
Yeah. But I think that repeated nature of it, like you spend so much time with it and it perhaps repeats quite a lot, it just becomes so familiar, and like, it's interesting. It can play different roles, can't it? You know, sometimes it's kind of front and center, and other times it's almost just a companion that's with you the whole time throughout the game, and you maybe don't give it much thought. But yeah, it is just part of the game.
So would you say that's like part of the reason that you listen to it is for that, let's say, nostalgia?
Yeah, I think there is an element of nostalgia and just wanting to feel connected, I guess, to the game. You know, it perhaps plays a similar role to something we've said before, where, you know, maybe there's a game that we really like, we can't play it right now, maybe it's hard to run or whatever, or maybe, like, you know, you want to see a certain bit and it would take 50 hours of gameplay to get to that bit. So anyway,
yeah,
something like that. Just watching like 5 minutes of a YouTube video of that game scratches the itch, and that's like, you know, I think there's maybe an element of that, of it kind of just like scratching the itch of like feeling connected to that game, and like listening to it is like, oh yeah, I'm back in that zone. But yeah, totally the nostalgia thing as well, for sure.
What I find very interesting is often, you know, I'm listening to these soundtracks on YouTube a lot of the time.
Yeah.
And often I'll scroll through the comments, and it's just comment after comment talking about how people feel nostalgic listening to the soundtrack, and even like sad. You know, people say like, oh, there's tears in my eyes as I'm listening to this.
Yeah.
Because people form such a special relationship with games sometimes, don't they?
Yeah.
Where it becomes, I don't know quite how to describe it. It's almost an emotional connection sometimes, especially I think games that you played when you were young.
Yeah.
They take a very like special place in your heart.
100%.
That sounds like super cheesy, but I think it's true for a lot of people. And the music just immediately takes you back there and kind of evokes, like brings all these emotions to the surface, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And for, as you say, for some people, especially so, if you were to browse, as you say, the comments of some of those videos, like some of them are like pretty gushing, and some of them are like really revealing, like quite personal, like, you know, like clearly the music has put them in such a place that they feel comfortable, or like, you know, they feel like they want or need to express this, like, you know, oh, it takes me back to this time in my life when everything was good, and, you know, this happened and this was great, and now everything's hard, and
now being an adult is terrible,
and my mum died or whatever, you know, and this just brings it all, you know, lets me know it's okay again. It's like, it's, you know, some of it's quite personal stuff. Anyway, but yeah, you as you say, it just kind of it inhabits this kind of special place, and it evokes, you know, some serious emotion. What do you look for, or what I was going to say, what do you look for in a game soundtrack? It's maybe a bit of a tricky question, so let me rephrase. You know, what kind of game soundtracks do you like to listen to, and why?
That's a good question. And that's a very different question to what kind of game soundtracks do you like?
Mm-hmm.
Because there are some games that I think have excellent soundtracks, but I wouldn't necessarily choose to listen to them outside of the game.
Okay. Let's come back to that one.
We'll come back to that. But to answer the question, what kind of soundtracks do I like to listen to? It tends to be the more tuneful, melodic ones, you know, ones that have a tune that you can pick out and, you know, you could sing along to it if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Rather than the more atmospheric soundtracks like Diablo, for example.
Yes.
Beyond that, I don't think there's a particular like pattern between the soundtracks that I listen to. Some of them are like happy, some of them are sad. They're all quite different.
Yeah. Yeah.
What about you?
Very similar. You know, I think it in general, yeah, like music that is like catchy or you could sing along to it, you know, you can recognize it. I mean, that's probably true of a lot of the, you know, of the qualities I look for in music in general, that I would choose to listen to. There is, of course, a place for more atmospheric music, and let's come back to that. But one of the soundtracks I come back to again and again is absolutely like bombastic and like fun-filled and just like, and there is melody after melody after melody that's just like, yes, this one, and I'm singing along and I'm just like, oh, and you already know what I'm about to say, but it is the soundtrack of Donkey Kong, the original Donkey Kong game. Oh my gosh. Donkey Kong Country, I should say. Oh my gosh, is that a killer soundtrack? You know,
it is fantastic.
I've listened to that and watched that video so many times. You know, but also someone on YouTube has done like an orchestral interpretation of that soundtrack, and so I've listened to that. That is awesome as well. It's been played live at like conferences and stuff, and the guy that wrote that, I think David Wise is his name. He will like, I mean, he's I think he's quite prolific in video game soundtracks in general, but also he will play like songs from that Donkey Kong soundtrack at like live gigs, which I just think is the coolest thing. And he gets cool requests for it, and
I think he even commented on the orchestrated soundtrack.
Did he?
To say like, you know, great job or whatever.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
So that is an example of, yeah, as I say, like this like bombastic, just funky soundtrack that I come back to again and again. I think another soundtrack that, of course, I'm going to mention is Doom, and that is like, again, filled with melodies and interesting bits that like stick in your head. And I think, you know, perhaps particularly for old games, I'm going to go out on a limb and say this, particularly for old games, the music needed to be really good because there was only so much space for it. You probably couldn't get too much soundtrack in it, and people are going to replay those levels again and again and again. You know, perhaps, you know, people are more likely to replay the game, or perhaps the levels were harder, so people would be exposed to the soundtrack again, you know, more because they're replaying those levels until they beat them. So I think it was really important. It's not to say it's not important now, but I wonder if it was, you know, there was a special or a particular thing about that time that it needed to be, you know, even better, or it was even more important. I think Doom 2, good soundtrack as well, but like it doesn't quite get, you know, there for me to the same way that Doom 1 does. The reason I'm talking about this though is, having enjoyed Doom 1 and Doom 2 soundtracks and like listening to them, and there are some remakes recently, by the way, against like a kind of modern interpretation. I'd recommend people go check that out if you're into Doom, because it's wicked. But I listened to the soundtracks for like Final Doom or like TNT or Plutonia, and all that is atmosphere. Like there is no melody, there is nothing catchy, there is nothing like to catch your ear. And it was so funny, again, looking at comments being like, oh, I love this song, or this one that's in, you know, an hour and a half in, this one's great. And there was some guy that like replied, or like, you know, you can see a comment further down being like, are you guys listening to the same thing I'm listening to? Because there's like, it all just sounds like drones, and like there's no, like, where's the music? Which I thought was so funny. Which maybe leads us to the atmospheric thing. And I'm going to hand that over to you, because I thought you started that thought, and I want you to take it forward.
Yeah, so the only example actually that immediately comes to mind is Diablo 2, which had a great soundtrack. and it still has like there's certain moments in that soundtrack that like are very iconic in my mind.
Yes.
Just little snippets, but for the most part it's very low key.
Yeah.
It doesn't stand out. It's atmospheric.
Yeah.
It's moody. And I think that's particularly effective. That was particularly effective for Diablo 2 because that was a very dark game.
Yes.
And if it had like a very melodic or upbeat or like standout soundtrack, that would have just been really out of place.
Yes.
So I think the soundtrack just has to match the game, which sounds obvious saying it.
Yeah.
And for Diablo 2, it absolutely did. I think some games, though, and I can't really back this up with examples, but I'm hoping you'll help me out. Some games kind of fall back on this kind of very underwhelming atmospheric music, maybe because it's easier, but it's not always that effective.
Mm.
Can you think of any examples of just underwhelming soundtracks?
Oh,
that are
gosh.
there because the game had to have music, but they clearly didn't really care that much about it.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to have a sneaky think, but all I can think of right now is just the thought and appreciation of like I'm in a level and there's no real sense of music, but there's just a bit of like, you know, a bit of atmosphere, sound, a bit of kind of humming and drone and a bit of like, you know, bits, just the musical bits here and there to let you know there is some music going on, but it's not like you couldn't say, oh, it's that one. You know, you couldn't say like it's not a recognizable.
Oh, I love this track.
Yeah, you couldn't do it. You couldn't say, oh, it's this song or whatever. I don't know. Weirdly, like Half-Life came to mind, but actually that has like a legitimate soundtrack. So I don't know why I feel that way. Maybe because there are quite a lot of times when it's not really playing the music, and so you just have a sense of atmosphere. Messiah, Might and Magic Dark Messiah, I feel also similarly had a lot of like dead space in it. That one, again, I think I remember it having a very similar feel to Half-Life 2, in that it just felt, I mean, it used the same engine and there are other things, but I just remember there just being this sense of like atmosphere and like tension, almost through lack of noise, through lack of there being too much like space being filled up with music. So I think there are times when it can be effective,
Definitely.
but there are also times when it can be forgettable. I wonder if it's something that's changed, and that it's certainly something that comes across in some interviews that I've listened to lately, where I think there is a sense that perhaps soundtracks used to be a bit more front and center. I think in the way they were presented in the game, like in terms of like the audio design, it was more like in your face, and here it is, and that's perhaps recessed somewhat. And I think there is a challenging. It's a challenging problem because there's only so much audio space that you can inhabit at any one time, and I think, you know, when games have a lot of other, you know, pieces of audio going on, you know, like it can be, you know, voices or, you know, enemy gunfire or, you know, rushing water or wind or, you know, all those like sound effects and all that other stuff. Like, you can't have it. You don't want your soundtrack kind of fighting for space or you know, trampling over that stuff, because that's really important for a player to hear. I wonder if, you know, as games have become more complex, that problem has become harder, and perhaps, you know, to allow room for some of that stuff, it's become less front and center. But it was certainly the case for, you know, Doom 2016 and Doom Eternal, that they kind of took the decision that, you know, it's going to be a really important part of the game. Like, it's front and center. It's a, you know, people sometimes talk about soundtracks being like a character, almost a character of the game. Like it's that important, and it does not shy away from that. I mean, the job they did there was incredible in that, you know, the music comes through so strongly, and yet you don't lose any of the important information or kind of sounds of all the action that's happening as well, which is amazing. But the other thing that's interesting about that, again, as games have evolved, you get more of music adapting to what's happening in the game, right?
Yeah.
So why don't you just explain that a bit for people that don't know? Like, what is that? How does it work? Have you perhaps like been involved at all with how that works in a game?
Sure. I just wanted to touch on Doom though, because you talked about the modern Doom games, and I think they very deliberately, as you said, they went for these kind of in-your-face soundtracks because they were basically going back to their roots, right?
Yeah.
After Doom 3, which was kind of a bit of a divergence for the series, they were like, oh, well, let's just make a proper Doom game. And the soundtrack was always a big part of Doom. And I wonder if Doom 3 is perhaps another example of a game with an underwhelming soundtrack. I can't say for sure because I can't remember the soundtrack at all, but the game was certainly very atmospheric, and I wonder if the soundtrack was probably a part of that.
Yeah, almost definitely.
Which is understandable, you know, because it was almost a horror game in some respects.
Yeah.
And the soundtrack, as we said, kind of has to reflect the nature of the game. So you can't have like a horror game with like a banging heavy metal soundtrack. It just wouldn't work.
Yeah. Oh, actually, I'm going to derail us. I need to take us back to what you said earlier about Diablo, which, you know, you said like there are sort of a few moments in that soundtrack that are kind of iconic, but the rest, you know, it's very atmospheric. There's not loads going on. Of course, you know, one of the moments is that opening like bram bam 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 bram bam bam yeah, all that stuff. Do 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 do.
Yeah,
you know, all that. Yeah, like that's the bit that you know, right? And I, you know, I think when they announced the new Diablo game, they got the guy who, you know, did the soundtrack to like walk on stage and play that bit, which is kind of a cool moment.
Cool.
But anyway, it was interesting to me when you were talking about that, because aside from that bit, I don't really know the Diablo 2 soundtrack at all. And that's because when I played it, I think I just got a bit bored of it. And also I was in a bit of a habit of doing this. I turned the music to 0 and I would play whatever music I wanted to play, and often it would be AC/DC. Just like blaring as I like would be playing Diablo. So it's interesting. Like, I think you're right. It did not, you know, it doesn't necessarily suit the intended feel of the game. You know, the atmospheric thing to have tension and stuff. I think, you know, it was probably the right call. But it was interesting. I just like turned that off and was like, yeah, I just want like rocking tunes as I'm like killing demons.
Some people do that, don't they? They prefer to just have their own music, which to me just feels like sacrilege.
Yeah, it's not something I do now, but I used to do it all the time when I was younger. I'll do the same. There were like, you know, when I first got into music, there were basically like 4 albums I would listen to on repeat. And there were like 2 Offspring albums and 2 Green Day albums, and I would listen to them endlessly. And when I hear those songs, sometimes images of Age of Empires come up, because that's what I was listening to when I was playing Age of Empires.
It's the same with me. There's certain songs which take me back to like when I used to make Doom maps.
Is it?
I'd spend hours in the editor and I'd have the music in the background.
Yeah.
It's funny, isn't it, how music can just immediately take you back to a certain time.
Yeah.
But you were asking about adaptive music.
You got it.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think as games have evolved, so has the role of music in a lot of cases.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than just having a soundtrack that's kind of fixed on a loop, let's say, often these days the music will be layered and it will be kind of created on the fly as you play through the game based on what's happening. So, for example, the music might ramp up in intensity when there are lots of enemies around, or maybe the music will become a bit muffled when you go underwater.
Mm-hmm.
Interestingly, there's actually a very old example of this in Super Mario World, which is that the music changes when you get on Yoshi.
Oh.
You get these kind of extra bongo drums thrown in.
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
Which is it's subtle, but it's there. And another example that comes to mind is with the Spyro Reignited trilogy, because they created this whole like dynamic soundtrack.
Right.
But then a lot of people weren't happy because people, are so fond of the original Spyro soundtrack. So they actually added the option you can choose whether to have the original soundtrack or the dynamic soundtrack.
Wow.
Which I think is good. I think it's good to provide that option.
Don't mess with the formula.
Yeah. But what do you think? Do you prefer one or the other?
I like it when... I think I like the adaptive music when I don't notice that it's happening. I think that's probably my favourite.
Right.
I think that's when it's most effective, is when it's like... It's done so thoughtfully that it just becomes part of the experience, and I'm not kind of mindful that like, oh, the music just got more intense because I'm in this, in this fight area or whatever. I think some games I've played have done that really effectively, and you don't even really notice. Things just feel more intense, and you're not quite sure why.
Yeah.
It's just part of the experience. You don't like it's just happening. So I think that's when it's done like really, really well. There are definitely other times when, I'm trying to work out like what game this is now, but you're safe when the like danger music has stopped. You know what I mean? You've kind of exited the danger area, and it's like the music transitions to like it's okay now.
Back on peaceful mode.
Yeah. So it's like everything's fine, and like I mean that in itself is kind of funny, but like perhaps is less seamless. It serves a different purpose maybe. Do I have a preference? As I say, I think if it's not done that way, then it's perhaps more. It can be more memorable. It also means the composers can approach each piece as a song. And I know that if when you get soundtracks like soundtrack albums at the end of games, and they've been put together as part of that kind of maybe you get like the gold pack version of the game, and that comes bundled with the soundtrack or whatever. Often those take a lot of work to put together. You might think, oh well, the music's all there, so just chop it up. Here are my 20 tracks. Off you go. But often they're not even formed songs. They're just like bits that come in and out, and there'll be different bits for different levels or sections or whatever. But those then need to become a fully realized song.
Yeah.
So that's not kind of you don't necessarily get that in modern games or games that take this more adaptive music approach. So I wonder if there is something to be said about composers getting the chance to approach a piece of music as a whole song. I wonder how that changes things. But certainly a lot of my most memorable soundtracks that I come back to again and again, they weren't adaptive, they were just songs. And like the ones that come to mind, I've mentioned Doom, I've mentioned Donkey Kong, Spyro I come back to all the time. Ratchet and Clank I come back to all the time. What a flipping great soundtrack.
Oh yeah.
Brilliant soundtrack. There was one game recently, actually, which is interesting. I asked you about it because I stumbled across the soundtrack from your list, and I was like, "What is this game? The soundtrack's amazing." And sadly, you had to reply and say "Oh yeah, everyone talks about how amazing the soundtrack is in that game. It's a shame the game's a bit
Which game was
middle
this?
of the road." Oh, what was it? Sword and Sorcery.
Sword and Sorcery.
Yeah.
Yeah. Really good soundtrack. think the game gained popularity in large part due to the soundtrack, but the gameplay is very mediocre, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And the opinions of many reviewers.
I wonder if there's a game, if there are games that like are middle of the road, but because of a great soundtrack, are elevated, and so you play this game because actually this is a great soundtrack, or vice versa. Is there a game that's like the soundtrack has almost put you off? I don't know if that's something you kind of necessarily think this soundtrack sucks, I'm walking away. But I wonder if you might kind of be subliminally aware, just like, oh, something about this, not into it.
I think my answer to both of those questions is yes, I have come across games like that. I'm struggling to think of specific examples, but recently I've been playing Anno 1503.
Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of the prequel, Anno 1602, but I never really got into 1503 for whatever reason. And I decided to pick it up recently, which is a whole saga in itself.
Oh,
trying to get that game working. But gameplay wise, it's much like the prequel. There's a few different mechanics, but it was very familiar, and I was playing it and I was enjoying it. And I think a big part of the reason I was enjoying it was the soundtrack, because it was, although I didn't have the same sort of nostalgia for the soundtrack, it was still like just good. It was just immediately enjoyable, and it fit the game very well.
Yeah.
And I was very conscious of the fact that I was enjoying the soundtrack as I was playing the game.
Nice.
I think that...
Sorry, because you were talking about Anno, in Anno 1602, that I think I'm really aware that soundtrack is quite basic. I think they basically just found a load of old-timey songs that had no copyright, and it was just like, let's just use those, and put some music, we'll make our own versions of those and ship it, pun intended. And but it's fine. It's not just fine. Like I kind of like it for that reason. It's like, I just kind of like, yeah, it's just all, I don't know. It's kind of a bit, it's a bit twee, is it a bit, I don't know, I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but it's something kind of familiar, and I quite kind of like it. I don't think you even necessarily need to have a lot of soundtrack as long as it's really good. One example that comes to mind, Knights and Merchants, 20 tracks. That's it. And they're always on a loop. So it's not like, you're halfway through the game and you get a new soundtrack, a new song. They're just always on the loop all the time. So, if you spent quite a long time playing level 1, you've heard it all. But, there are a bunch of tracks on that soundtrack that I look forward to every time. They bring a smile to my face, whenever they come on. And there is one, and Dan knows which one it is, that strikes fear in my heart and stress every time it plays. It's called Struggle, and that is almost always an immediate skip. It's just like, I can't do it. Skip.
It's so funny because we've introduced friends to this game even in recent years.
Yeah.
We still play this game to this day, and I can't remember who it was who played Knights and Merchants for the first time, and when that track came on, this track Struggle, they said to me, is something happening? Am I being attacked? Or they thought that the music had become so intense because, in response to something that was happening. Because most of the tracks, they're so upbeat. It's we're in this merry little town, and look at the townsfolk, aren't they cute? And then suddenly you get these war drums, and it's terrifying.
Man, and if it plays at the start of a level, and you're just I'm just building a bit of road, I'm building my first building, and it's stress. It's like,
Yeah, but it's just part of the loop.
it's just yeah. Oh man, yeah, I do return to games like sometimes because like I think certainly that like the music is part of that package that I want to return to. Another game that has a good soundtrack. It's a game called Trine.
Oh yeah.
Did you know there are 5 of them now? By the way,
5 trines.
5 Trines. That's a successful series. Any game that can claim it's got 5.
Yeah.
I think your memory is a bit different to mine.
I enjoyed it. No, I had a great time playing Trine 1 and 2, but like, am I going to play 3 more? I don't know.
I'm not sure if I'll play 3 more, but I think I might play 3. In fact, that's probably. I was wondering the other day what game did I think? Oh, I should put that on my wish list. I think I might put that on my wish list.
Yeah.
Anyone listening to this podcast, I'd recommend Trine. It's just this lovely adventure platformer puzzle game. You get to play like 3 playable characters, and it's just nice. Occasionally, I think this is Dan's criticism of it. You can occasionally cheese the puzzles by just like taking advantage of the physics in the game and stuff like that. But I just thought...
I remember cheesing a lot of levels as the wizard. I don't mind that. I mean, that's part of the fun.
Yeah. So yeah, that's just a shout out to Trine for anyone listening.
Kingdom Hearts, as you know, it's a game I've been playing fairly recently.
Yeah.
Can you hear the toilet flushing?
I did not hear the toilet flush.
Okay, hopefully that's not on the mic. So, Kingdom Hearts, as you know, is a game I've been playing recently. And I basically found out about that because of the soundtrack. I think I might have mentioned this before. But
right.
Yeah, it's just got like a really great soundtrack. I came up on a YouTube playlist or something. I think it came up quite a lot. And I was like, wow, what is this? This is amazing.
Yeah.
And that was partly why I gave it a go.
Nice. Yeah, I've stumbled across a few actually. A few soundtracks just because they're recommended from other things I've listened to. You know, another one actually, similar era to Spyro, Ty the Tasmanian Tiger.
Oh really?
Yeah,
it's got a good soundtrack.
It does have a good soundtrack, and it's kind of very much, it would fit in the same, definitely in the same sort of box as Spyro music.
Yeah.
And the game is, it's that kind of 3D adventure platformer. It's that sort of game. But yeah, I just stumbled across that one time, and I was like, "This is cool! Like, this is great." I've come back and listened to that a bunch of times.
Do you know there's been like a big community effort to recreate the Spyro sound font?
Ooh, go on.
I don't exactly know what a sound font is, but I think basically they've tried to find the original sources, the original samples, for a lot of the sounds that were used in the creation of that soundtrack.
Yeah.
And that's basically enabled the community to make a bunch of their own tracks that sound exactly like the original Spyro soundtrack. Like they would fit right in.
Awesome.
And someone actually interviewed Stuart Copeland, the composer of the Spyro soundtrack.
And drummer for the Police.
And they played him like a bunch of tracks, some of his own and some fan-made ones, and had him basally try and guess.
Really?
Is this one of yours or is this a fan-made track?
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Oh, man. I love that. Yeah. So, right. I mean, you've already mentioned the Stuart Copeland thing. That was going to bring out a few fun facts at this point in the podcast. So, yeah, Stuart Copeland wrote the music for Spyro's 1, 2, 3 and 4, maybe? But yeah, I think that's really cool. Actually, okay, to the sound font thing, I watched an interview of him, because they were talking about Spyro and it coming out, the reignited stuff, because they didn't approach him to do the music. They got someone else to like painstakingly like recreate the whole soundtrack, but to make it sound as close to the original as possible, basically, which is so funny. And he was like, if they'd asked me, I would have just like sent them the files, or sent them the things they needed to make happen. Which I thought was, because he doesn't own it. Like they as part of the contract they own the music. But anyway, one thing he mentions there is like there were these CDs that were coming out at the time, and actually, if you listen to game soundtracks and other soundtracks as well, you'll notice this, that there are certain like sounds and like loops and just bits that are thrown into music soundtracks that are all over that era, because I think they all came on these like sample CDs and these like music resource packs that you could buy and then use in recording and music. And so you start to notice them like, it's there in that Spyro thing, and it's over here in this other game soundtrack over here, and it was like you find it everywhere. So he was like, he still has the CDs that he used sometime, and like again he like could have shared those, but whatever. So that was an interesting bit of trivia. But the other thing about video game music, which I think is appropriate to bring up here, is that with some video game music, what I listened to and what I heard may not be the same to what you listened to when you played the very same game.
What? Is this because they're like MIDI sounds?
Yeah. So back in the day when like video game soundtracks were made, like I think probably for data storage, space reasons.
Yeah.
There would just be MIDI files, which is like information to send to an instrument to play the soundtrack, to play the music. So you haven't necessarily recorded like a piece and exactly how it sounds. You've basically like think of it as almost like here's a sheet of music, and now send it to your band to play. So in this case, the band is like your sound card.
Yeah.
And a PC might have a different sound card to another PC, or a console might have a different sound card to a PC. So the exact same music can sound wildly different, or at least pretty different, depending on what you played it on. And there are like there are certain soundtracks from the past that people are like, but they're like the one, like the critically like everyone has to agree this is the one, the reference one might be the one that was on PC, or the one that was on the Atari Jaguar, or whatever it is. It's like is that version is like mwah, that's the one. That's such an interesting, like, it's those times are gone, but I just thought it was such an interesting setup, or kind of set of circumstances to be in, that like your music could just sound wildly different if someone's playing your game on a different machine.
And you can do some really fun stuff with that. Like you can take the Doom soundtrack but play it with Mario instruments.
Yeah.
And then it all sounds kind of like Mario.
Yeah.
What you were saying about the soundtrack CDs as well, like these kind of music CDs that people would use.
Yeah.
Reminds me of how you get the same with like sound sample CDs, So a lot of the time you might be watching a TV show and then you hear a sound and you're like, hold on a minute. That's from Doom.
Yeah.
Like I know that sound. I'd recognize that anyway.
The amount of sound effects I recognize from like Doom and other games is crazy.
Yeah.
There's this like sound that's often used in like explosions, but it's also the sound that like the final boss in Doom 2,
the Icon of Sin,
makes when he like shoots an enemy out of his head. Like he like,
yeah.
And it's like, oh, that's the noise again. It's almost like because I think quite famously now there's that sound effect used in so many films I think it's called the Wilhelm scream. Is that right?
Oh yeah.
And that's it's like to the point where I almost find it a little bit annoying and lazy. Like just like jokes over, guys. But anyway, it's like it's throughout, like even from the 80s throughout to modern films, you'll hear this particular sound effect. And I think like for me, it's like almost on the same level. Like they are so widespread, and yet I can like hear them in games from the 90s.
Yeah. There was actually also a similar case recently where there's like a certain rock texture was identified in lots of different games, and it basically came from some texture library that was just used, in a lot of different places. Maybe particularly in Japan, but I'm not sure.
Right.
So yeah, you see it all over.
That same texture has found its way into
reused.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's so fun.
We've talked a lot about music in a fairly generic way, but I would love to just give some shout outs to a few soundtracks.
Okay, wicked. You go first.
Okay, in particular, I feel it would be remiss of us not to mention the 2 that we use in our podcasts.
Yes.
Actually 3, we use 3 technically. So for the intro, we use Hocus Pocus, which is a classic MS-DOS game. For our interlude sound, we use a sound effect, / music. It's very short.
Yeah.
I don't know if it constitutes music or a sound effect, but it's from Eldritch, and that's used with permission. I did an interview actually with the developer of that for my Minecraft YouTube channel.
Yeah.
And he was kind enough to let us use that sound effect.
Very cool.
And for our outro music, we use music from my game, actually, which was written by my friend Charlie.
Absolutely great soundtrack. Anyone that's listening, I recommend go listen to the Abacus soundtrack. You can find it on Spotify. That is one of my regular go-tos as well. I have to say, it's just an excellent soundtrack, man. Like, there were times I wasn't sure he was ever going to finish it, because he made a couple of tracks and they were really great, and then there was this hugely long gap between that and the rest of the soundtrack, or at least this was my perspective anyway. I didn't see what were the inner workings, but it seemed to me, whilst you were developing the game, there was a couple of tracks, nothing for years, and then the rest happened, and it was wow. And I remember you being oh yeah, he's gonna do it, he said he's gonna do it, and I just kept on thinking he's never gonna do it.
Really?
Yeah, I was just oh man, I'm so sorry. I'm kind of sorry for Dan, or I wonder how this is gonna pan out, because just it's that project's dead to him. There's no way he's coming back to it, several years on and finishing it. I just thought that's never going to happen. So when it did, I was blown away. And not just that, I was blown away that it happened at all. And then I was blown away that it was just so good. I love that soundtrack.
The trouble was the scope evolved a lot over the duration of that project.
Okay.
So initially, I didn't really have a lot for him to go on. I just said, hey, can you make me some music? And he was like, sure, here's some music.
Yeah.
And it was great. But then as development progressed, I wanted to go for more of a sort of story. There are 5 worlds.
Yeah.
And each world has a theme. And so he ended up making different music to suit each world. And then the music he'd made originally became the multiplayer music.
Right.
But he did a fantastic job, and he did kind of make different versions of the tracks that were used in each world, so that as the worlds progressed, the music kind of more layers got added.
Yeah.
So World 1 starts with this very simplistic music, but by the end of World 1, it's the same tune. There's the same what do you call it? Motif.
Yeah.
It's the same motif throughout, but he builds on it, and it becomes more and more intense as you get closer to the end of the world. Honestly, yeah, he did a fantastic job. I wish I could have paid him more had the game made any money whatsoever.
Yeah. Man, yeah. Well, what can I say? It's a piece for the CV, isn't it? You can say, I've did the soundtrack to this game, and it's a great piece to show, and it's a great piece for me to listen to.
I really hope that he can make more game soundtracks in the future, because he's so talented.
Yeah.
But before we wrap this up, are there any soundtracks you wanted to shout out?
Yeah, and I'm hoping we're going to be dropping some little clips in here.
Sure.
So, I think it'll be interesting for people just to hear E1M1 of original Doom. So here we go.
Dun, 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 dun. That's what you meant, right?
Yeah, who doesn't know that? And now here is like the modern interpretation of it in the new Doom games. So what you probably would have heard there, you'll probably feel like it's sort of is in keeping with it, but it's not the same. And that's absolutely right. But the way that the composer talks about it is like, I've used the same notes, essentially. It's kind of the same like rundown. That there aren't quite, it's not as fast, but like he's kind of using that same sequence. And that's how he's kind of adapted like that iconic track that everyone knew and kind of turned it into something new but familiar. I just, as a fanboy, just like every time there are little like moments and nods to the old soundtrack, or just to be honest, like complete remakes of like a track that might have been in the old game, I just felt that soundtrack didn't put a foot wrong. Everything was just like, yes, this is absolutely wicked, and it's ticking all the boxes for me as like a Doom fan, and it just sounds great, and so yeah. Interestingly, the Hocus Pocus thing, because you mentioned it, I listened to the whole soundtrack of that recently, and I realised that half the songs are pretty much the first song. Like,
are they?
Yeah, because you have a few, and it's like, oh yeah, different, and then you're halfway through it, and you're like, isn't this the first song again? And then you realise, oh, it's the first song, but it's like got a slightly different. I don't know. It does. I don't think it does the trick like Abacus does, where it evolves the tracks enough that they feel distinct, even though they're the same. It just kind of felt like it was the same track. But anyway,
I feel like Hocus Pocus, the soundtrack, honestly isn't phenomenal, but I just love that first track.
Yeah.
When I say first track, the title music that we use for the podcast.
Yeah.
Absolutely love that.
Banger.
Yeah. A couple more I wanted to shout out. Actually, there's so many. I feel like we've left this till the last minute to actually call out all these amazing soundtracks. But one of them is old school RuneScape.
Oh,
what a great soundtrack!
Yeah.
And what's really cool about that is they've been very generous with licensing, so you can use that music in YouTube videos and such, and people do all the time.
Yeah,
it gets used everywhere. But I really like that. I don't like it when companies are like super stingy and do copyright strikes if you use any of their music.
Yeah, absolutely.
I get it, but also I really respect like what they did with the RuneScape soundtrack.
Yeah. Well, I think we should just drop like a few seconds of like the title track, or maybe Busy of Knights and Merchants here. Your favourite track from Anno 1602 here.
Imagine if I just left those as like long silences.
And I think Rival Realms as well.
Yeah.
Listeners of the podcast probably know already, Dan's working on the project's Open Rival, and the idea is to again make like that old game playable and new systems, etc., and like make some improvements. And that has some great tracks in it as well. So we should play one of those here.
Another one I wanted to mention, just because it's incredibly unusual, and maybe you know what I'm talking about here. It's something we used to listen to a lot and kind of sing along to.
Oh, I'm intrigued.
You'll kick yourself.
I will.
It's the Neverhood.
Oh, ow. This is me kicking myself. The amount of times I've listened to that soundtrack. It's completely bizarre and wacky.
It's unlike any other soundtrack, but it fits the game so well because it's this very strange like claymation adventure game.
Yeah. You know what? I think perhaps more so than any other we've just mentioned, that is a great example of the soundtrack being like a character in the game. Like that, the game would not be the game without that soundtrack. Like it would be cool, don't get me wrong, but like that brings so much of the character and the whole feel of the game, and like the whimsy and the silliness. It's I could, yeah. I
Yeah.
I actually can't. I'm struggling for words because I'm just that amazed and impressed at that soundtrack. And like, fair warning to anyone looking it up after this episode, it's bizarre, but that is absolute. That's what makes it great.
A couple more. Hollow Knight. What a great soundtrack that is.
What a soundtrack. Oh my goodness.
Yeah. I sometimes fall asleep to the relaxing Hollow Knight music compilation.
Do you? Yeah.
Yeah. And another one, Elder Scrolls. All the Elder Scrolls games.
Yeah, 100%.
Excellent soundtracks.
Really, really great. Jeremy Soule, I think. Soule, something.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, this is pretty mainstream, but we can be mainstream occasionally. The Halo soundtrack, for me, out of this world amazing. Really, really good.
Really? I've not listened to that one.
Yeah, I mean, the opener in particular, with the kind of there's some choral singing and then it sort of goes into this guitar piece. That is like super recognizable, but there's some great piano stuff in there. It's just a really great time, and it all feels very epic. Like the whole time you listen to it, it just feels like epic and meaningful and like powerful. And interestingly, again listening to some interviews, that is like particularly now where I think budgets are perhaps less than they were in the early noughties for things like soundtracks. Like that is a great example of like a big budget soundtrack, like full orchestras, 20-piece choirs, all that stuff has gone into that soundtrack to make it what it is, and it's amazing. And yeah, you don't often get the budget for using things like full orchestras and that sort of stuff these days, because that gets real expensive real quick. Okay, how could I leave an episode about game soundtracks without mentioning Heroes of Might and Magic 3?
I knew it.
Oh my goodness. I have come back to that so many times. And I'll just tell this little story. Some years ago, I remember thinking, like sometimes you have those questions or those little thought experiments of like, if I were rich, what would I do? That sort of thing.
Yeah.
And you know what? Like, after you've exhausted all the boring stuff, like, I'll buy a big house and I'd do this and blah, blah, blah. I was like, you know what I'd do? If I had money and just to burn, I would pay an orchestra to learn the whole score of Heroes of Might and Magic 3 and like play it in a theatre for me and my mates. That's what I'd do. And then like a year or two later, I found that an orchestra is doing this. And like there is a YouTube channel called the Heroes of Might and Magic Orchestra or something. Now, sadly, they're in like Czechoslovakia or something. They're in like Middle Eastern, Europe, and they don't really play anywhere near where we live. But they've done like recordings of their shows, and they are doing shows. And the guy that wrote the stuff, occasionally he comes to visit to be part of the show, and it's like it's so cool. And like, if I could go to one of that, like, I would love to go and see that sometime. I don't know if it will ever happen because it's impractically far away, but that is just the coolest thing. Again, it's another example where like each piece is kind of a song, or at least a small, at least a kind of a written piece of music, even if it's short. So recognizable. Again, I guess it's because it's it's not a short game most of the time. I guess a quick game of Heroes might be half an hour. That's fast, but probably
that's rapid.
That is a rapid small map. You're likely spending several hours on one map, at least. So, you are hearing these tracks again and again, and I think it's just worth mentioning how this game uses music, because it has different pieces of music depending on the terrain you are in. So there's one for grass, there's one for dirt, there's one for swamp, there's one for, so like the different, depending on where you are, you've got different music. But also you have different music. I mean, obviously for combat, you get the different music. I mean, that kind of harkens back, also to the Pokemon thing. Like every time you're in a battle, it's like, oh, it's that track.
Yeah.
I mean, there are 3 different tracks, but they're all similar. But then each town, iconically, has its own music. So when you're in the town and you're building your buildings and you're doing whatever you're doing there, each one of those has its own theme, and which just kind of puts you immediately in like place of that town and the kind of feel of what that town is about. Each town is themed by, these different sort of mythical creatures and sort of groupings of mythical creatures, and they have quite strong identities, and the music, I think, is a huge part of that. So yes, I could not let this one go without talking a bit about Heroes of Might and Magic.
Maybe now that you're so rich and successful from this podcast, you could pay for
I'll pay them to come
the
over
orchestra
here.
to come to you.
Yeah. Yeah, keep buying that merch. We need to make some merch.
Actually, that's a point, Chris. If people have questions, comments, if people want to get in touch with us, how can they do so?
That is an excellent question. At this stage of the podcast, please do drop a comment in. If you're listening to us via YouTube, you can drop comments on those videos, and we do see them and we often respond. So please do that. If there are other platforms, so I think you can post like comments or reviews on like Spotify and elsewhere. So if you can, do that, and we'll look out for those. But I think we have the beginnings of plans of making some other way for you to contact us.
Basically, we need to get an email address set up, but we haven't yet.
Strong. If there are any questions or topics you want us to explore, then please do get in touch. Also, if we were to make merch at any point, what would be your request? What would be like the thing that you'd want?
I'll tell you what we'll do, Chris. I'm going to confidently say, and I can always edit this out, I'm going to confidently say, email us at kneedeepinthepod@danjb.com.
Boom.
And then that will give me a kick up the backside to actually set up that email address.
Nice.
Excellent. Well, we should probably leave it there.
Yeah, it's been a great session talking about video game music. That's it.
That's it. You're hearing the Abacus soundtrack right now. Go check it out. It's on Spotify.
See you next time, gals and girls.
See you later. Did you say cats and girls?
Gals and girls?
Gals and girls? Is it only girls listening?
In my mind, it's just women listening to our podcast. That's our demographic.